My name is Patrick. I'll put my next slide on. This is my last slide. We own and operate a craft distillery, or whatever you want to call it, in Holland. Small distillery. We do about 25 tons of grain per week. So it's a little bit bigger than here, but it's smaller than Kirin. Yeah, it's much smaller. You do it probably in the morning. We make whiskey, malt whiskey, a rye whiskey, and we also make a typical Dutch product called Genever. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Yeah, it's good, eh? Better than whiskey. No. And I think today we're going to focus on the whiskey side of the business. So the presentation is on, what do you do to make new whiskey styles? One of the things I find important in doing whiskey is that you have to respect the tradition of what is whiskey. So I'm not in favor of making new products for the sake of making new products. If I innovate, and we do a lot of experimentation, a lot of innovation, we always try to look at what does whiskey need to taste like and how can we improve on that flavor profile. We got, of course, different approaches where you can look at different kind of ways to innovate. We do a malt whiskey, which is very traditional. Yeah, we mill the grain in a roller mill. We mash it in a mash tun. The big difference with Scottish whiskey is that we use a full lauter tun instead of a semi-lauter tun, but it's a kind of a small technical difference. The thing we do different from most of my friends in Scotland is that we make a very clear wort. So the sugar water that we drain from the grain is very clear, much like they do in Japan, I think. Why do we do that? Not because a cloudy wort doesn't give a good whiskey, because it can give great whiskey. But a clear wort gives you a lighter flavor profile, maybe more akin to Japanese whiskey than to Scottish whiskey. So if your wort is cleaner, clearer, you get less higher alcohols formed. You know what that is, yeah? So less grainy flavors, and therefore the esters, the fruity flavors, the flowery flavors, get more opportunity to shine. So that's one of our philosophies. Next thing we do different is, after mashing, we do fermentation in temperature-controlled fermenters. So that means standard way in Scotland is you have a set temperature, can be 70 degrees, can be 15 degrees, can be 20 degrees, depending on the outside temperature. What we do is we set at 20 degrees Celsius, we pitch the yeast, and then our fermenters have water jackets, and we keep the fermentation temperature at between 20 and 24 degrees Celsius. So we start with the first 2 days at 20 degrees Celsius, then we slowly let the temperature go up to 24 degrees Celsius, but in a controlled way. The upside of this is that you get a long, gentle fermentation. Because I had a question for you, but I didn't get a chance to ask you. You were talking, I was going to now. You were talking about lactic acid bacteria in your fermentation, which I think is very important. And lactic acid bacteria are the king of fermentation because they produce in symbiotic relationship with the yeast. And they produce a lot of the fruity flavors that we so love in our whiskey. But do you also lengthen the fermentation time to give your lactic acid bacteria more time to interact with the yeast? Yes, see? So most of my friends in Scotland have gone down from 72-hour fermentations to 48-hour fermentation to keep up with the demands of production. We did exactly the opposite. We went from 5-day fermentations. We lengthened them to 7-day fermentations. 7 days is pretty long, which is pretty inefficient because you need shitload more fermenters.
That's a technical term.
Beep. Yeah, yeah. You need way more fermenters if you do longer fermentation, because you can, a Scotch distillery can use the fermenter 2-3 times a week, and we only get to use that same fermenter 1 time a week. So they're a little bit bigger. We have 10,000 liter fermenters, and we have a lot of them.
Would you say that that's a major difference between, and this isn't right and wrong, but if I go around distilleries in Scotland, a lot of the talk is about yield and efficiency.
It's not good for the yield. It's not good for the yield.
So you will take a hit on all of that in order to produce a specific flavour.
I love Scotch whisky. Scotch whisky, in Scotland they make...
I think we all do.
Yeah, they make perfect whisky in Scotland. But as a smaller producer, you need to make a point of difference. And you need to make whisky that is a little bit different from the Scotch whisky. So if I do exactly the same as my friends in Scotland are doing, I'm not adding anything to the market. So I like, the Japanese style whiskey. I like that fruity, delicate flavors of the Japanese whiskies. So that's where I was aiming at more than the Scottish style. And then I'm, of course, I like the scientific approach. So I don't go hit and miss. You do research and you try to find what works and what flavors are created at what moment in time, in what stage of the production process these flavors are made, and you try to recreate them in your production process. So we do long, cool fermentations, which gives us a nice fruity beer. Yeah? We spend a lot of effort on the fermentation side of the business. I know our business is all about the shiny copper stills and all that, yeah? And we all love the copper stills, and we are all in love with the copper stills. But the beer that you brew, because basically that's what we do, the first step in our production, the beer that you brew must contain all those flavors, or at least a lot of the flavors that you later have in your new make. Because you can separate some out in distillation, and of course you get some esterification in the copper stills, but the basis must be there in the beer. So we spend a lot of effort on brewing the best beer that we can brew. So in order to do that, we used a mixture of Belgian brewer's yeast and, of course, M-strain distiller's yeast, which of course is a very good high-yield yeast, a perfect yeast. Gives you 410 to 420 milliliters of alcohol per kilogram of grain, which is really nice for the accountants. My stupid brewer's yeast does something completely different. It gives me only 335 milliliters of alcohol per kilogram of grain. That's 20-30% less than my M-strain. But it gives lots of fruity esters and lots of flowery esters, depending on the strain that you choose. We choose 7 different yeast strains for different products. So we have an unpeated malt whiskey, which we mix a Belgium, Abbey yeast with the M strain. We have a peated malt whiskey where we mixed an ale type beer strain with the M strain. So we have different yeast for different flavor profiles. See, I told you I wouldn't get past the first slide. But another thing, we do malt whiskey, but we also do whiskeys made from other grains. And this is actually really interesting. We do I think a really nice rye whiskey. Don't know if you had my rye whiskey. No? You should be ashamed of yourself.
You should do. It's awesome.
So we do a really nice rye whiskey, but we also use different other grains. We do a 5-grain whiskey. But last year I made a whiskey from spelt. Look. Have you know what spelt is? Yeah, spelt is like a prehistoric, stupid wheat variety. It is. It's a really silly kind of grain. So it's like a very old-fashioned wheat. And we had it malted in Germany, and because no Dutch maltings would touch it. And that spelt gives you something completely different. We treat it as we would the malted barley. So we run it through the lauter tun, the mash tun, instead of, with the rye whiskey, we ferment on the grain like they do in America, like they do everywhere. But for the spelt, we do it the same way as we do the malt whiskey. So we make a clear wort. It's just that it doesn't work. It doesn't run off, it doesn't filter. The filter bed clogs up, and it's like a disaster to filter it. The other day, we were doing it in December, and I was 11 o'clock at night. We were still the second water running off. Yeah. My colleague that started it went home. Don't know what's that all about. But if you try new grains, it is nice because they're full of unexpected flavor profiles that you do not find in malt whiskey. I love malt whiskey, but it's also nice to experiment with other grain varieties. If you look at
how would you define spelt? Then?
Except for stupid.
Except for stupid.
Well, spelt runs off because it has a lot of beta-glucanase, the thing that makes rye whiskey, rye mash so sticky. Mm-hmm. That is also a lot of high percentage of it in spelt. So that makes it run off and clog up the mash filter of the mash tun, the filter bed. But the flavor profile is really unique because you get, if you do a wheat whiskey based in wheat, you get these nutty flavors. If you do rye, you get these spicy flavors. And if you do spelt, you get these almost flavors like baby oil. You have your children? It's like this soft, gentle sweetness that you get from baby oil, and you get that in your new make, and it's really interesting. I don't know what the whiskey is going to be like, because that's still aging, but I make a Geneva with it, and that's actually really, really nice.
And how's that? Because that will have come out. So it retains that baby
for the Geneva
oil aromatic character.
Yeah, for Geneva we triple distill instead of double distill, and then we do partially redistill it over botanicals. And then we age it for only a year, so it was quicker than stupid whiskey that has to age forever. But aromatically it's really nice because you get this kind of gentleness, so this kind of, I make a rye Geneva as well, which is like bold and big and nice and round. But this has got some, gentle sweetness to it. It's also very appetizing, I think.
But you were saying you're also doing mixed grain. So is that a mixed mash you're doing?
Yeah, we do mixed mashes as well. For standard Genevas, for example, we do a 3-grain mash, much like a bourbon mash. We do a third corn, a third rye, and a third malted barley. Ends up with a really nice new make. We triple distill that, so it ages quicker, because Geneva is also sometimes drunk at a younger age than whiskey, so you need to make your new make a little bit cleaner, otherwise it's undrinkable by the time you want to bottle it. We're digressing, aren't we?
Yeah, well
I tend to do that.
That's the nature of the beast. Any questions at this particular point? We continue talking about grains and stuff. I'm interested in the rye because I think it was the first time I visited you and you produced the rye. And I was
crying, wasn't I?
And I was just kind of, oh my God, where did this come from? You're not making, you're loving Scotch whisky, but you're not making it in your malt whisky in a Scotch fashion.
It's like Yumi said, 99% of what we do in the malt whiskey.
The 1% is different. How is your 1% difference between your rye and, say, a classic American rye? Is it just in distillation, or is it in the way that you're handling the
Most
grain?
of the American ryes, of course, are 51% rye, and then they fill up the mash bill with easier grains like corn and malted barley. We do the rye mash the hard way, so we do 100% rye mash. So we use 50% unmalted rye, which we mix in at 85 degrees Celsius. And then we cool it down a little bit to about 65 degrees Celsius, and we mix in 50% of malted rye. They're both milled in a hammer mill, so it's finely milled. So basically you end up with 10,000 liters of wallpaper glue. Have you ever wallpapered your house? You know what wallpaper glue looks like? That's what you end up. You end up with a tank filled with 10,000 liters of wallpaper glue. If the end result was not special, I would not touch rye ever again in my life, because it's a difficult grain to work with. But the thing about the rye mash is, you can imagine if you have a clear beer, like for malt whiskey, if that ferments, you get this nice white foam on top, like on your glass of beer, and it's fluffy foam, yeah? Now look at the 10,000 liters of wallpaper glue and see all those bubbles coming through that. So you don't get nice fluffy foam. You get big bubbles and sticky bubbles that don't, break easily. So if it ferments too quickly, so if you don't control the temperature right down to slow down fermentation, sometimes half the tank ends up on the floor the next day. So you come into the distillery and you say, yeah, because there's this much on the floor. So you have to ferment it really slowly, and you have to keep it cool so that you get a nice, it stays in the tank, and you get a nice beer from it. And then we ferment it in a pot still, of course. A pot still is different beast than a column still.
Yeah.
In America, they run it through a column and maybe to a doubler. But it's a different way of distilling. It also gives a different character to the spirit. A pot still gives this kind of roundness to the rye whiskey that is different from the character that you get from a column distilled rye. Again, I'm not saying that one thing is good and the other thing is bad, it's just different.
Yeah, it's that need for differentiation. We'll be talking about rye in a wee while as well in our second lot of speakers. But we do have a question here from Mr. McCormick. Oh, you can.
Just shout it out.
Patrick, my question was just about co-product distillation. So obviously in Scotland we've got the draft from the malted barley that can either be used for energy or fed to the cows. But when you're using all these other grains, is there a secondary use for this whole thing? The foaming rye?
For the spelt, for the spelt it's easy because where I live, my neighbor has cows. So every night, the neighbor comes to the distillery and he brings a cart, and then we load it with the spent grains from the malt whiskey or the spelt whiskey, because that he takes off. But at the end of distillation day for rye whiskey, you end up with 2 pot stills filled with 7,000 liters of finished mash, and then we just drain that. It's properly disposed of. Don't tell my environmental auditor, yeah?
So it will not leave this room.
No.
We've not been filmed or anything. Yes, question down front here.
One question in regard to the cut points
Yes.
in distillation. There is probably one of the main differences between European style whiskey and Scotch style whiskey is that we are more conservative on the fainty side, I would say, in general. So how do you deal with the cut points on the faints?
I look at it from the other way around. I always look at what do I want to make. So what style of whiskey do you want to end up with? So I love Macallan, for example. I always use Macallan as an example, but I love Macallan. I think it's one of the best whiskeys out there. But Macallan is not a whiskey that you can drink after 5 years. It's a big, oily kind of new make. And it's got these strange fruity esters in it. And it needs time in a barrel to age properly. I love Macallan after 15, 16 years. Then it comes to its true self. If you cut really narrow middle cut, if you take a really narrow middle cut, just the very light stuff, whatever you do, it's never going to be Macallan. Never going to reach that flavor profile of Macallan. So you need to approach it differently. You need to approach it. What style of whiskey do I want to make? And I need to make my cuts according to that. If you want to make a big, rich... Oh. Stop, okay. No, if you want to make a big, rich whiskey, then you have to cut a little bit later. And then you have to accept the fact that you cannot bottle it after 5 years. So you have to leave it 12, 15 years before it ages properly. And all that shit about small barrels and all that doesn't work. Yeah? So you need to leave it. And if you want to bottle something after 3 or 4 or 5 years, You need to think of that before you start mashing, because then you start with a clear wort. You start with lots of fruity esters in your new make, so that means a small middle cut. So you have to make your cuts according to what you want to make, instead of the other way around.
Clear wort, clear head. Do you want to go on to slide 2?
Well, what slide?
I
never got to slide 1.
Any questions about any of these weird grains? We can come back to this later on, or we can move on. Of course, there happens to be one from Norway. Yeah.
One question on rye. When you're talking about low fermentation temperatures, what temperature do you ferment the rye?
The first night, I want to keep it below 20 degrees Celsius, because there's a lot of sugar in the mash by then, so it can start really vigorously in the first day. So in the beginning, start, the temperature quite low, preferably on the low side and on the high side, so that it doesn't ferment out of your tank, and you keep it all nice and nice and easy start, so the yeast gets a chance to develop. And then after a while, you can let the temperature go up a little bit, because most of the sugar will be used up anyway. And then if your temperature goes up a little bit, you give more opportunity to your lactic acid bacteria, because they like it a little bit warmer. So if you let the temperature go up a little bit, you give the lactic acid bacteria a little bit more time to focus and to create that symbiotic relationship with the yeast, so you get more fruity esters formed.
So you're fermenting for the same amount of time?
No, it's actually 1 day longer. It's an 8-day fermentation, sometimes 9. Yeah, it's a long. The rye is actually an English ale yeast, I think, combined with the M strain. But it's a long, slow fermentation, even longer than the other one. But that's also partially because of the first day, that you want to keep it extra cool.
I love this. You obviously you have forensic attention to detail. I think that's fairly obviously coming through here. But how much of some of the initial thought process is, let's just see what happens? How much improvisation is there to begin with? Just like, I've never made spelt before.
No, okay, but I started.
Are you rigorous from the word go?
Both. I grew up in a distillery. My father started the distillery when I was 4 years old, so I spent my life, polishing stills from the inside, because I was small as a kid. So I grew up in the distillery, so I saw everything, and I lived it, and I breathed it as a kid. So after I finished my master's, I came back to the distillery and think, I want to do this. So I started experimenting. And a lot of that you will never taste, because a lot of it was not very good. That is my biggest advice. If it's not good, do not put it in a bottle. Yeah, you can experiment all you want, because experimentation is the best way to learn what you want and what you don't want. But if it's not good, don't put it in a bottle, because, I was this big when my father told me, everybody can sell a bottle of spirits once. But what you want is that guy that you sell the bottle to come back next week to the shop. He says, I want another bottle of that. And he has to tell his best friend, now I found something that I really like. So that you create word of mouth around your brand. And I think that is probably the most important thing that we've lived by all our lives, that whatever you do, whatever grain you choose, whatever you experiment, it has to attribute to a better whiskey or a good whiskey or something that's really, that you would like to drink yourself. Mm-hmm. And yes, when it comes to experimentation, sometimes I do something new, like the spelt. Yeah? You start and you buy. Now I've bought a couple of tons of einkorn. You know what that is? That is 2 generations before spelt. You got wheat, you got spelt, which is the precursor to wheat. Then you got emmer, which I'm losing my help. He's going to fix me up. Oh, yeah. Emmer is like the precursor to spelt. Then you've got einkorn, which is probably what grew in the wild way back when. So now I bought a couple of tons of emmer and a couple of tons of einkorn just to try and see where that leads me. I don't know, like you.
It might work, it might not.
It might not work. Yeah, if it doesn't work, you'll never talk about it again.
That's good. Well, we've got about 5 minutes to get through your other 2 slides. So, what's next?
Yeast strains, fermentation temperature.
Move on.
Still design.
Here we go.
We use pot stills for everything, because that's what I've got. I haven't got a column. I haven't got one of those batch kettles. I want to talk to you about that. I don't know what that is. But, innovation can come from a lot of different places, and one of the things that it can come from is from the still that you use for your products. And I think one of the best examples I've seen in the past couple of years is the 3-chambered still from Leopold Brothers. Did you follow that? They found some old still design from the 1900s. Maybe Matt knows more about it than me. But they found an old still design, and they had Thingy make it in the US, not Forsyth's, Vendome make it for them in copper. And they say it creates all kinds of new flavor profiles for them. I've not tasted it, but it's one of the example, I think, of innovation. Doesn't have to come from really complex things. It can come from something simple as a reincarnation of an old still design, or it can come from simple things.
It sounds like an old rum still, perhaps. It was like kind of
I've
weird,
never,
weird 19th century.
The original design was made in wood.
Wow. Probably is a rum
They had it
still.
made in copper, but it looked really impressive. Have you seen it? Yeah, and it's like 3 chambers on top of each other. Huh? Yeah, it was really interesting design. I thought it was cool. I think I've got to have a look at that.
Find out something more similar still design going in Scotland, perhaps. Yeah.
Well,
Later, guys.
that's
Don't
nice.
go away.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. More? I thought we had 20 minutes. That was over
And there we are.
10 minutes ago. Yeah, aging. Yeah, we are all talking about aging. I think the big difference between the way we approach aging to what other people do is that we're not trying to be efficient. Every distillery has to be efficient in the way that you use your finances for the distillery. But we're not trying to be efficient to the point where your products are suffering from your efficiency. That means really good wood is important for any kind of distillery. So it is useless to take a bourbon barrel, refill it, and then refill it 4 more times after that. Yeah. You're not going to get a really amazing whiskey from that. You can't expect that. It will work if you do a really light, fruity whiskey and you don't want any cask influence. Then it's a viable option. But for all the rest, for a malt whiskey, I think the cask influence will be too little. So really expensive wood. I've got, of course, this fetish with sherry casks. Yeah? And where most of my friends are using seasoned casks, I've got this fetish with old butts. Butts in the sense of casks.
It's a bit too far, yeah.
I like butts.
We're
as
all
well.
grown up. It's
But
fine.
yeah, but I've got this really fetish with old sherry butts. Yeah, I love that. I love these 500 liter straight from the bodega. The other day I bought a whole bodega. Yeah, so 300 casks straight from the bodega to the distillery and filled them right there and then. It does cost a lot of money to do that, to buy 300 casks. Even the freaking transport from Jerez to Holland is expensive. But it pays off because you get these wonderful, intense sherry flavors from them. I usually prefer them from the second fill because the first fill can be so aggressively in your face, intense. But the second fill is usually a little bit more balanced. Things that are interesting. I had a friend in the US that used maple wood. You ever use maple wood? No? Maple is very interesting flavor-wise, but it leaks. So my friend said he would never touch it again because they had stainless steel pans underneath the casks, and every night they had to refill it into the cask because it was leaking so badly. So it's probably...
Maybe avoid maple.
But chestnut seems to be a viable option. I had some casks, was over some PX casks from Spain made of chestnut. But I think in Europe there's something that you cannot use chestnut for whiskey, is it? That's true. Eh? You have to have oak. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So
they
can use
used
it-
to use in Scotch, chestnut was used, especially kind of post-war. But
Why did they stop that?
the law changed and they clamped down onto just oak. Yeah.
So chestnut is interesting, but I can only use them for Geneva and not for whiskey. But the cask itself is a very nice cask. So we already talked about warehouse conditions. I think warehouse conditions are very important. Yeah? And, you know, help! My ears are not big enough. Warehouse conditions are very important. And yes, another wine finish is not innovation. Yeah?
Any questions?
They all fell asleep.
Yes, we have. No. They were all captivated, I think is the word.
Hey, Patrick, could you talk a little bit about still design and sort of still choice? Because you use Holsteins, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And you make amazing whiskey. And then there's some people who have decided they don't like, in Taiwan, for example, don't like Holsteins and it didn't work out. But you make a great whiskey. Is there a secret to sort of the way you spec them out or the shape or
You know,
how important is the
how the
shape
still
to you?
looks is, you know, the shape of the helmet and stuff like that. Do you really think it matters whether it comes from Vendôme or freely in Italy or from Forsyths or from Holstein? I think where you buy the still is not important. The exact shape of your helmet will influence your reflux rate at some point. But reflux is also something you can control by the flow, how fast you run the still. When I meet my friends in Scotland, we don't talk about how high the skill is or how low the still is. Usually we talk about how fast do you run your still, because that's sometimes, often, most of the times, says more about the flavor profile than you can have a really high helmet, yeah, really high. But if you run your whiskey at 30 liters a minute, none of that alcohol is going to have any chance of touching the copper or, you know, condensing and refluxing back into the pot. So I think what you distill is all about you, about who you are, how you run the still, how you feel the spirit. And it's not so much to do whether you buy the stills from Freely or from Forsyths or from Vendôme or from Holstein. They're all good stills. They're all decently made. They're all made from high-grade copper. You need copper, yeah. You need for the binding of the sulfur. You need copper.
And
But
fill level? I mean, is that a big thing for you?
Fill level is really important when it comes to foaming. Yeah, if you have a high foaming mash or wash or whatever you want to call it, you want to fill it a little higher. We have 8,500 liter Holsteins that we fill at a 5,000 liter level. It's also because I have 10,000 liter fermenters and then fits nicely into stills. But yeah, I think it's more how you run them than and whatever. If you fill them really high, which I sometimes do, because that's how it sometimes works out, you can still run them. You just have to run them a little bit slower.
And just one more question. Those 500 liter butts, what's the time frame on that in terms of minimum? What would you expect to have to hold those out to age those 500-liter sherry butts minimum?
Well, you can taste some PX, peated PX whiskey from a PX butt, and that's been there for 5 years or 6 years, and you can taste that. So judge for yourself. I think it takes a little bit longer than a 200-liter one, but it also depends on your spirit more than on just of the shape of the cask or the size of the cask. The size of the cask says something. I'm not a big fan of any cask under 200 liters. I've tried it, didn't like the maturation profile that it gave. I like 200-liter casks, but I also like them a little bit bigger. But yeah, you need to wait a little bit longer for the same effect.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. That's our first 2 sessions completed, and I think just in those 2 sessions we found out so much, about Japanese whiskey. One of the defining factors of Japanese whiskey is to make a whiskey which appeals to the Japanese palate. The importance of being local, of growing your own barley, understanding barley, having your own cooperage, understanding Japanese oak, and then this experimentation, but always with that vitally important thing at the end of it that Patrick was talking about. It's got to be drinkable. People actually have to want to drink this. So you can go away on an ego trip, but that's not necessarily going to end up with sales. And actually, whiskey is a business as well. It's a dreadful thing to say, I know, but you do actually have to end up selling whiskey as well. So a huge amount to pick up with. Think about these points, because we're all coming back up on stage later on. Plenty of more discussion to be had. There's now coffee, there'll be drinks coming out. Sorry, tasting coming out. But please put your hand together for Patrick Zuidam.